September 1956. Memphis, Tennessee. The backstage corridor of a large venue on the outskirts of the city. 7 in the evening. A man named Roy Delaney is telling B.B. King where he can and cannot go, and he is doing it with the comfortable authority of someone who has been doing this for a long time in a part of the country where this kind of authority had, for a very long time, gone uncontested. Roy Delaney was 51 years old. He had been promoting shows in Memphis and the surrounding region for 19 years. He had booked country acts, gospel acts, rhythm and blues acts. He was not a man without appreciation for music, which was one of the things that made the rest of him complicated. He booked black artists. He understood their commercial value. He paid them less than he paid white artists for the same rooms, seated them differently backstage, refused them access to the main dressing rooms, and enforced, in the venues he worked with, the particular architecture of separation that was simply how things worked in Memphis in 1956, in a way that was so ordinary and so established that most of the people operating within it had long since stopped seeing it as a choice anyone was making. B.B. King was 32 years old in September of 1956 and had been playing guitar since he was a boy in Edabana, Mississippi, and had been, for the previous several years, one of the most significant figures in American blues. His guitar tone, his phrasing, the specific quality of feeling he brought to the instrument, already forming the vocabulary that would define the genre for the next 60 years. He had been performing in Memphis for years. He knew Roy Delaney. He knew Roy Delaney's backstage corridors and his seating arrangements and his separate facilities and his particular manner of enforcement, which was always polite, always regretful in tone, always done with the specific emotional efficiency of a man who had decided long ago that the system he was operating within was not his personal creation and therefore not his personal responsibility. On this particular evening, Delaney had told B.B. King that the main backstage area was reserved for tonight's headlining act and that B.B. and his band would be accommodated in the secondary room at the end of the corridor, which was not the room with the mirrors and the proper lighting and the chairs and the running water. It was the room that had a single bulb and a folding table and a bench against the wall. B.B. King had heard this before. He had heard variations of it in dozens of venues across the South for the better part of a decade. He had developed, across those years, the specific internal economy that black performers of his generation developed in order to continue working. The ability to receive this kind of information and process it without allowing the processing to be visible on his face or in his posture, because allowing it to be visible was not a luxury the work permitted. He said, "All right." He picked up his guitar case and began to walk toward the end of the corridor. He had taken 4 steps when a voice came from behind him. It was not Roy Delaney's voice. It was a voice that B.B. King recognized before he turned around, because there were not many voices in Memphis in September of 1956 that sounded like that one. The specific quality of it, the South in it, the particular vowels. He turned around. Elvis Presley was 21 years old in September of 1956 and was already, by every commercial measure available, the most famous young entertainer in America. He was the headlining act for tonight's show. The main backstage area, the room with the mirrors and the proper lighting and the chairs and the running water, was being held for him. He was standing in the corridor between B.B. King and Roy Delaney, and he was looking at Roy Delaney, and what he said was 3 words. He said, "That's not right. Where are you watching from?" Drop your state in the comments. I want to see how far this story reaches. Roy Delaney looked at him. He said, in the patient tone of a man explaining something to someone younger, that this was standard procedure, that the arrangements had been made in advance, that Mr. King and his band were being accommodated in the secondary room, which was perfectly adequate for their purposes. Elvis said, "It's not adequate." Delaney said, "Elvis, I understand you might feel..." Elvis said, "I'm not talking about how I feel. I'm saying it's not right." The corridor had gone quiet. The people in it, crew members, the assorted personnel of a 1956 touring show, had stopped what they were doing in the specific way that people stop what they are doing when they sense that something is happening that is not in the ordinary range of backstage dynamics. Delaney said, "This is how we do things here." Elvis said, "Then change how you do things." He said it simply, not loudly, not with the performed righteousness of someone making a public statement. Simply, the way you say a thing when the thing is clear, and the saying of it requires no elaboration because the clarity is self-evident. Delaney looked at him for a long moment. He was 51 years old and had 19 years of promoting shows behind him, and he was not accustomed to being spoken to this way by anyone, and certainly not by a 21-year-old performer, regardless of how famous that performer was. He said, "I don't think you understand the situation." Elvis said, "I understand it fine." He picked up his own guitar case. He looked at B.B. King. He said, "Come on." He walked toward the end of the corridor, toward the secondary room, toward the single bulb and the folding table and the bench against the wall. He walked the way he walked most places, with the unhurried directness of someone who has decided where they are going and is simply going there. B.B. King watched this happen. He said years later in more than one interview that he had stood in that corridor for a moment and had not entirely understood what he was seeing. He had been in a great many backstage corridors in a great many venues in the South, and he had never, in any of them, seen this particular thing happen. He had seen producers argue about billing. He had seen performers argue about payment. He had never seen the headlining act of a show walk away from the main dressing room because someone else had been put in the wrong one. He picked up his own case and followed Elvis to the end of the corridor. What happened next, in the secondary room with the single bulb and the folding table and the bench against the wall, was something that the people who witnessed it described differently across the years. The musicians in B.B.'s band who were present, the crew members who drifted in and out, the people who heard it secondhand from people who were there. The accounts are not entirely consistent in their details, which is the nature of accounts that pass through many years and many tellings. But in their essentials, they agree. Elvis sat down on the bench against the wall. B.B. King sat down at the folding table. The other musicians arranged themselves around the room. And they talked. They talked about music, specifically, not generally, not the polite surface conversation of two performers exchanging professional pleasantries, but the specific, detailed, mutually invested conversation of two people who care deeply about the same thing and are in the presence of someone who cares about it the same way. They talked about guitar tone. They talked about the blues, where it came from, how it worked, what it did that other music couldn't do. Elvis asked B.B. questions, and B.B. answered them, and B.B. asked Elvis questions, and Elvis answered them. And the conversation had the particular quality of an exchange between equals that are also students of each other's work, because that is exactly what it was. B.B. King had already been recorded and admired by Elvis Presley before that night. Elvis had grown up listening to B.B. King's records had absorbed the specific vocabulary of B.B.'s guitar, playing into his own musical understanding in the way that young musicians absorb the vocabulary of the people they love. He knew B.B.'s work the way B.B. knew his own work, from the inside, from repeated listening, from the kind of attention that is also a kind of study. He told B.B. this, not as flattery, as information. He said what specific recordings had done to him when he heard them. He said what he had tried to understand from B.B.'s playing. He said what had not yet made sense to him, phrasing it as a genuine question because it was a genuine question. B.B. King said later that it was one of the best conversations about music he had in the 1950s. He said it with the specificity of someone who was not speaking in superlatives but making a precise claim. One of the best conversations. In a room with a single bulb and a folding table and a bench, in a venue on the outskirts of Memphis in September of 1956, because a 21-year-old with the biggest name in American music had picked up his guitar case and walked to the wrong end of the corridor. Roy Delaney had, in the meantime, attempted to address the situation through Elvis's manager, who was present at the venue. The manager had listened to Delaney's explanation and had told him, in the specific language that managers use when they are delivering a message they have received from their client, that Elvis Presley had made his preference clear and that the preference would be honored this evening, and that if future bookings were going to involve Roy Delaney's venues, the arrangements would need to be revisited. Delaney had not been pleased. He was not, however, in a position to argue with the headlining act of his own show 2 hours before the show began. He had made the calculation that 19 years in the business had trained him to make, and he had let the evening proceed as it was proceeding. The show happened. Elvis performed. The crowd was what 1956 Elvis Presley crowds were, the particular hysteria of a cultural moment that had not existed before him and would not exist again after him in quite the same form. B.B. King performed his set. He played guitar with the specific mastery of a man who has been playing guitar since he was a boy and who is, at 32, at the point in a musician's development where everything learned has been integrated into something that can no longer be separated into its components. Afterward, backstage, B.B. King found Elvis. He said, "I want to thank you for what you did earlier." Elvis said, "I didn't do anything special." B.B. said, "That's not true." Elvis said, "It should be true. That's the point. It shouldn't have to be special to treat somebody right." B.B. King said this exchange was one of the things he had kept with him across the following decades. Not the act itself, though the act mattered, but that specific answer. It shouldn't have to be special to treat somebody right. Said plainly, without performance, without the pride of a man who had done a good thing and wanted acknowledgement for doing it. Said as a simple observation about the world as it was and how it differed from the world as it should be. What happened in Roy Delaney's corridor in September of 1956 was not a large event. It was not a march or a rally or a moment of public declaration. It was a 21-year-old picking up his guitar case and walking to the wrong end of the corridor and saying, when someone tried to explain why he should not have done it, "Change how you do things." That is a small thing. It is the smallest thing available in the face of a system. It does not dismantle the system. Roy Delaney continued to promote shows in Memphis and the surrounding region for many years after September of 1956. The secondary rooms at the end of corridors continued to exist. The arrangements continued. But B.B. King went home that night, having been in a room where the headlining act had sat on the bench beside him and asked him real questions about guitar tone. And Roy Delaney went home that night, having been told, plainly, by the biggest name in American music, that how he did things would need to change if he wanted to continue doing them with that name. And the musicians in B.B.'s band went home having seen something they had not seen before in a backstage corridor in Memphis. And Elvis Presley went home without mentioning it to anyone, as far as any account available suggests. No comment to the press, no reference to it in later interviews, no story told by the people around him in which he described the evening as one where he had done something notable. He had picked up his guitar case and walked to the end of the corridor. That was the whole of it. It was, said B.B. King, more than 50 years later, enough. It was enough for the evening. It was enough for the accounting. What Elvis Presley understood, B.B. said, was that the right thing doesn't need an audience. The right thing just needs to be done. 3 words. That's not right. He said them plainly in a corridor in September of 1956. And then he picked up his guitar case and walked. If this story reached something in you, share it with someone who needs to be reminded that the right thing doesn't require a stage or an audience. Just the willingness to say it, and then walk in the right direction. Subscribe for more stories about who these people were in the small, unrecorded moments that mattered more than most of the recorded ones. And tell us in the comments, have you ever said the right thing in a corridor when it would have been easier to say nothing? Leave yours below. There is a particular kind of courage that does not look like courage from the outside because it is so simple. It does not announce itself. It does not require a crowd. It does not produce a speech or a declaration or any of the forms that courage is usually expected to take when it is being performed for an audience that will remember it. What it looks like from the outside is a 21-year-old picking up a guitar case and walking to the end of a corridor. What it is, from the inside, is the moment when a person sees something that is not right and decides in real time, with no preparation and no plan and no audience to play to, that the seeing and the doing are the same thing, and that the space between them is not a space that needs to be managed or considered or weighed. Elvis Presley had grown up in a part of America where the system Roy Delaney was operating within was not a system anyone had to explain to him. He knew what it was. He had grown up adjacent to it, the white boy from the shotgun house in Tupelo who had learned his music from black radio stations and black churches and the specific vocabulary of black American blues that had been present in the air of his childhood as thoroughly as the air itself. He had absorbed that music the way you absorb something when you were young, and the something is everywhere, and you have the specific kind of attention that takes things in and keeps them. He knew B.B. King's music. He knew what it had cost to make it. He knew the corridor and the single bulb and the folding table and the bench, not from personal experience, but from proximity, from having grown up in the same South, in the same years, in a family that also knew what it was to be put in the wrong room. And when he saw Roy Delaney point B.B. King toward the end of the corridor, he said 3 words and picked up his guitar case. It's not right. He was 21 years old, and he was already the biggest name in American music, and he did not use either of those facts as part of the argument. He did not say, "Do you know who I am?" He did not say, "I'm the headlining act." He did not make it about his own importance or his own preference or any of the things that would have made the moment about him. He said, "That's not right," and then, "Change how you do things." And then he walked. B.B. King followed him. They sat in the room with the single bulb and talked about guitar tone. The show happened. Everyone went home. The corridor is still there in whatever building has stood on that site since 1956. Roy Delaney has been dead for decades. B.B. King died in 2015 at 89 years old, one of the most celebrated guitarists in the history of American music. He kept the story of that September evening with him. He told it in interviews. He told it in conversation. He told it the way people tell the stories that matter to them, not as a footnote to someone else's biography, but as an accounting of something specific that had happened to him in a corridor in Memphis, and that had told him something true about the person who had made it happen. The right thing doesn't need an audience. It just needs to be done. 3 words. A guitar case, the end of a corridor. That was enough.